What's up, gamers? Pope Kenny here to cleanse you of your DMing sins. Oh, you think you don't have any? Everyone's a sinner, and we're going to talk about them today. So you better buckle your seatbelt because we're taking this Pope Mobile to the moon. So without further ado, let's get into the seven deadly sins of DMing. First, sloth. Now, this is going to be obvious, but you need to prep for your games. Some people can get away with highly improvised games, and that's fine. But typically those people are well experienced, so if you're new to DMing, I highly suggest you prep. But what's more important than just prepping is kind of how you prep. So, and this could be a whole video on its own, but I'm going to kind of just boil it down to a couple quick tips that I have for how I prep and how that's helped me limit my time and maximize my efficiency with prepping for my game. So one thing that you should implement is ask your players at the end of each session where they plan on going next. Once again, seems obvious, but people fail to do it, and then they end up writing a lot of things for places that the party is not planning on going on at all, and you just waste a lot of time. Second, always review your notes from last session, and yes, please, for the love of God, take notes during your session. You need to have a decent recording of what all happened because there's a lot of things that you could easily forget, especially like write down what really excited the players. Like if it's an NPC that you kind of just made up on the fly, like write their name down, have that so you can reintroduce them at a later point. Also, when you're thinking about designing the location, or you need to have the location that the party is going to, let's say that you're going to a new city, think about like the major things that they're going to encounter there. Like if you're going to a city, have like who runs the city, some random shops that they can go into, and maybe like one or two like random events if you want to have like a festival or something else that they encounter, like they witness like a scuffle between two factions. These kinds of things, like things that are going to take place at that location. And if it's like a dungeon, like who lives there, or the wilderness, like what lives in the area, what animals live there, what could they actually discover? Are there any cool ancient ruins? Are there any cool magic artifacts that they could find? So limiting the scale of what you're prepping is like you're just going to do what is going to be prepared for the next session, but you're thinking about it in a way that you don't have to flesh out the entire city. Just what are they going to look for and encounter in the city, and then make up the rest during the session. And then finally, just think about what the antagonist is doing in the meantime. The antagonist should be actively working against your players. So just think about, okay, how are they moving their plan forward while my party is moving forward trying to work against them? Now let's talk about something a little more personal. Pride. Your ego. You shouldn't let your ego get in the way of your DMing. The way you shouldn't let your ego get in the way of your DMing is, listen, if you don't know a rule, just admit it. D&D and Pathfinder both, whichever poison is the one that you choose, they're both very complex games. Pathfinder, obviously, way more complex, but they're both relatively complex in what they are. And there are a lot of rules. And you as a dungeon master, there is an expectation that you will know all of them. But as is very possible, you might trip up sometimes. And that's okay. I am giving you permission to not know a rule sometimes. But if you don't know the rule and you decide you're going to make a ruling, you can end up making an awful ruling, like a terrible ruling that just breaks your game. And I have done this. I have made rulings that did not make any sense and totally screwed me out of, because then you have to kind of go back and be like, hey guys, this rule that made it really easy for you to do something, you can't do that anymore. So it's like when you give something and you take it away, there's like there's a little bite to it that people don't like. Players don't like that. So what do you do if you don't know a rule? Well, first, you could just ask your players if anyone knows how that works, and that's perfectly acceptable. And if they don't, you could take the time to look it up. If you really have no idea what the rule is supposed to be, that's one thing. If you have a general idea, then I would suggest maybe just try your best to make a ruling if you have a general idea. But if you genuinely have no clue, just look it up. I know that it can disrupt the pacing. And if it ends up taking too long for you to find it, just go ahead and make a ruling, or maybe ask for your party's good graces and be like, hey, that's a really cool idea. I don't know how to implement it right now. I'll make sure to look it up afterwards. But for right now, can you choose something else to do? And if your party's cool and if you're friends, they should be able to have that level of graciousness with you. I would say especially, look for things. If there's something you don't know works about a person's class, like allow the player to explain it, because they're staring at their character sheet the whole time. And there's a lot of different classes with a lot of different abilities. You probably haven't played them all. And you have a lot of other things you're balancing. So if they think it works a certain way and wants to ask a question about it, I mean, they're probably right, but it's always good to double check. And the last thing I want to say on this is, like, none of us want rules lawyers at our tables. Like, what I'm saying about players is that you should look for their guidance. But also, if someone is actuallying you a lot, which I've seen happen, it just really throws off the pace. It takes away from other players' time. You need to communicate with them and just be like, hey, listen, I appreciate that you are really excited about the game, that you know all the rules. I know I'm going to get things wrong sometimes, but for the sake of just like keeping things going steady, I'd really appreciate it if you kind of just allowed me to make my rulings and move on. So moving right along, rules lawyers piss us off, and other kinds of players can piss us off too, as DMs. This happens from time to time, and it's something that we can all struggle with, but we must not let our wrath get the best of us. Wrath, trying to make your players fail, is a rough one. There is an antagonist to the party. Most likely, in most games, there is an antagonist. And you, as the DM, roleplay as this antagonist, but you, the DM, are not the antagonist. And I think that sometimes, and I catch myself in this too, you can feel very defeated as the DM when the players just keep on, easily overcoming the obstacles that you're putting in place. And this can be really frustrating because you want to challenge your players, right? And you want to put them in dire situations, just for the sake of drama and having stakes to the game. Like, if the threat of death is real, then it's going to feel like a very different game than if they're just able to run around killing everything. But you should not design encounters that are dependent on your players failing them. So now it's story time, and I love story time. I was once playing in this game, and I was playing a gun master, whatever Matt Mercer's homebrew 5e subclass is, with guns. And his name was Kitapa, and he talked like this. My name is Kitapa, and he's a chauvinist asshole. And we had our friend. My best friend was this guy, Crocky, who was the big brutish type. He was a barbarian, very slow to speak, and he was kind of just like my guy. He was my right-hand man. And then we had one other friend who was in the campaign. They were playing a ranger, but not important for the story. So we were level 6, and we had just gotten a boat, and we were sailing across to a series of islands. And we were attacked by pirates. And the pirates had these sleep potions. And the sleep potions, they lobbed all over the deck of our ship. And the DC to overcome these sleep potions, it was a homebrewed thing. It didn't follow like this sleep spell. Okay, because then it would have never put Crocky to sleep. The DC was like 20 or something, which at level 6 isn't like insanely high, but it's fairly high. Further, if we made the first save, because the gas would linger, even though we were on a moving ship, we had to make a save every single round. Every single round. And the way it was presented to us was like a combat encounter. So we were just feeling like, well, this is clearly just unfair and one-sided. Which could have clued us in like, hey, you're not supposed to win this one. You're supposed to just go to sleep and be chill. But we were not going to let that happen. We actually ended up winning that fight, and it was really stupid. My barbarian friend, Crocky had like something stupid like a 20 or a 22 Constitution score because the DM had also given us like extra powers beyond our classes that he had made up homebrewed. And when me and my friend were reading them, we realized that they were completely broken. So we took full advantage of this. So I had telekinesis for no real reason, but I wanted it and it seemed cool. And it was totally busted. So what I did was the pirates on the opposite ship, they kind of brought the ship closer. The pirates on the opposite ship had these gas masks. And I was like, could I get one of these gas masks? And the DM was like, I don't want you to have that. So he decided these gas masks are like glued to the pirates' faces. And I was like, well, that's not going to stop me from trying. I'm a cruel tyrant. My name is Qatar, but I don't stop. And I use my telekinetic powers to literally rip a mask off of someone's face. I rolled for it. He had a set DC. I rolled super high. And I kind of pulled off this guy's face, which was a little grotesque, but I mean, that's the way he set it up. That's the way it had to go. And our barbarian, like I said, he had a 22 con score. He just didn't fail any of the saves. Our ranger was out of commission. They, failed immediately, could not wake up for the life of them. So Crocky and I'm blasting with my pistol. They're jumping onto the ship. Crocky is like just destroying them. And the DM was clearly frustrated when we ended up winning that fight because he didn't know what to run. So if you design all that to say, if you design encounters that have the idea that the players are going to lose, the players don't want to lose. They will do everything that they can to win. They do not like running. They do not like submitting. So he was frustrated. If we had just lost, we would have been kind of frustrated and taken out of it. So no matter what, with the way this encounter was designed, if you design an encounter for your player to fail, someone is going to be frustrated at the end of it. Design your encounters to challenge your players. You could even design encounters where you don't know how they're going to get out of it, but be excited when your players find ways to overcome the impossible. Speaking of giving your players too much, let's talk about greed, but not greed for you. I'm talking about giving your players too much. As a DM, you have to be careful in what you give to the party, because if you give them too much, it's going to be impossible to design encounters that actually challenge them. And it's going to make the game too stale. So even though they're really excited to have these cool new magic items, if they break the game, it's going to lessen the experience overall. And it's not just magic items. It can also be like if you give really generous rulings all the time, it's like you kind of end up making the game too easy. The first time that I ever DM'd, I did not know anything about balance in the game, really how the mechanics work. I had played D&D like twice before, and I had played in both of those. I had never ran a game. And this was the first session of my first campaign ever. I wanted to give my party a cool magic item, so I looked up good magic items to give your level 1 party. And when I Googled that, what came up is something called the Copper Dragon Rapier. Now, veterans of the game will know what the Copper Dragon Rapier is. It is the reward for the players at the end of the Rise of Tiamat game, which is supposed to end, if I recall, it's supposed to end at level 20. I do not know why this came up in my Google search, but it did. And so I was reading through the abilities. I was like, hey, that sounds really cool. I don't really know what any of this really does, but that sounds really cool. Better yet, there's a Copper Dragonborn in my party. So that's pretty sick. And so after that, I had, the whole set of the campaign, like what they were going to be doing, like prepared. Because when I was starting out, I was an over-preparer. And they just killed everything. Every single encounter that I designed became completely moot because of this ridiculous sword. I'll put the stats right here. It gives them spider climb. It can cast spells. It's ridiculous. The party still had fun that night because it was like, the one night and we got the badass sword and it's a bunch of kids who've never really played D&D before. playing, experiencing this thing for the first time. So everything was still fresh. But but when I went back to my dorm room that night, I was just like, I looked myself deep in my eyes in the mirror, and just like the sheer horror you could see in my soul is like, what have I done? So I didn't really know how to resolve this situation. And a couple sessions later, I just kind of took it away, which was not the best way to go about things. My friend's, his copper dragonborn, he was pretty miffed. He was also named Milo Self-Esteem, which is funny little tidbit, but that's neither here nor there. The other thing is talking about rulings, right? And you as a DM need to learn to say no. There are a lot of bad reasons to say no, and a lot of players will complain about it. And I feel like that's what most of the discussion around saying no ends up being about, is times where the DM had a specific way they wanted you to handle an encounter and would not let you go about doing the creative thing that you came out because it wasn't the solution he intended. But in other times, it's very important for you to be able to tell your players no, or that doesn't work. For example, and this happens a lot with new players, the cheeky bard sees that he has a persuasion skill. He goes up to the king and says, "Give me your crown." And he wants to be the new king. Now, you could say, well, you can roll persuasion, but the DC is going to be stupid high. But the way at least 5th edition is set up is like, that you're setting yourself up for failure. The bard is going to roll a nat 20 on that roll, and you're going to be like, well, now what? Because certainly he's not going to do that, or he wouldn't do that. But you've set it up to where by allowing them to make that roll, by making that an option that they can take, you set an expectation that it was possible. And now you have to, now on that nat 20 roll, you have to fulfill that expectation. But you don't want to do that for your world. So instead, just say, no, the king would never do that. It's just not going to work. The player might be disappointed, but they should also realize how absolutely ridiculous of an antic that is. Another thing that I kind of do, and this is another thing that I learned from Matt Colville, I'm not copying him. Another thing that I'll do is if I think that a character starts acting out of their character, right? So if a player is doing something that betrays the idea of the character that they've thus presented, I'll challenge them on it. I'll say, like, is that really what your character would do? Or, make it a little more friendly. Be like, well, why do you take that action? Present it so, you keep your players in check about the role play that they're doing. If they start acting out of character, there's usually something else going on, or maybe they just didn't think about it that much because they were distracted by something else. And it's okay for that to happen, but, multiple times I've had players where I point out to them and they'll be like, oh yeah, I guess I wouldn't. And then they'll come up with a different way. They'll get back in, they'll get re-engaged with the game because they're thinking about what their character would do again. And it just overall promotes a better experience. You don't want to do that over and over again, right? If you have a player who just isn't that into role play and is kind of just doing their thing, that's fine. If that's how they're going to be and you enjoy having them at your table, totally cool. It's whatever. But keeping the role play kind of focused on the characters, especially if that's a part of the game that you really enjoy, like I do, that's not something that has caused any unnecessary conflict at my table. Now we're going to talk about something a little more serious. Okay, we're going to talk about it seriously. Lust. Some players like sex in their games. Some players don't. Either is fine, but you need to make sure you are not creating, and you need to make sure that you are actively working to prevent uncomfortable situations. Now is a story. I'm going to tell you a story that I really like telling, but when I was 16 and I played D&D for the first time, I was completely turned off the hobby and disturbed. I grew up very conservative Christian family, by the way, very prudish. And And so having this as my first D&D experience was interesting. And if you follow me on TikTok, you've already heard this story, but we're going to go into more depth here. So shout out to my TikTok where I upload dumb stuff. So the first time I ever played D&D, I went to a game store to play with strangers. My friend had invited me, so I had one friend there. We didn't even know how to make characters. So we went there. They asked if we had characters, and we were like, no. They asked us if we had dice, and we were like, no. They were like, okay. The guy who behind the counter, he was pretty nice about it. But he kind of just plopped us down on the table. At the table, there was a younger couple. I say younger, but they weren't younger than me. They were like 20-somethings. And there was this mom who was probably 40s, and her son who looked around 12. And the mom and the son, they were chunky monkeys. They were larger people, which is not a point to fat shame, but they had showed up. Both of them were eating 2 cheeseburgers and a bunch of fries as we were playing. And that's not that important, but I think the visual is nice to have when I explain why I was so bothered in the next 2 hours of playing. So at first, it sets out pretty cool. I don't really know what to do. I don't feel really confident and comfortable just saying things that I want to do. So I'm asking a lot of questions about what I can do. We're exploring this tower. I'm playing a rogue. I don't remember what my friend was playing, but I was playing a rogue, and I ended up scaling, using a grappling hook I had in my inventory to scale the outside wall. So we ended up skipping a couple of encounters, which was fun. But we end up going to this room, and we clear this room, and in the center of the room is a table, which is normal for a room to have. It's kind of a bigger dining room table. And I forgot to mention this, but the mom, her character is continually flirting and making suggestive remarks to the girlfriend's character. And it clearly made her uncomfortable. And everyone else was uncomfortable. And the boyfriend was kind of and the DM was kind of but he didn't know what to do. And we're talking about Oregonians here. So whenever an uncomfortable situation is presented to us, our instinct is to just be like, this is fine. And it's like the meme of the dog in the house on fire. It's like, this is fine. So in this room that we just cleared, the mom has her PC climb up on the table and start stripping and sexy dancing. And this is the point where you look over to her 12-year-old son and you just see death in his eyes. He's way past. This is not the first time this has happened. And he's looking down into the abyss right now. And everyone's like, okay, lady, we're going to go to the next room. And then she starts making fun of us for being uncomfortable with it. She starts talking down to us. It's like, oh, what, you got a problem with this? And she starts making fun of, in particular, the girlfriend. And that's not the worst part. What happens next is something I fail to comprehend why another human being would ever do this to another human being in the setting that we were in. The mom goes over naked. The mom's character, clarify, the mom's character, naked, goes over to the girlfriend's PC and starts trying to take her clothes off. The mom asks the DM if she can roll for it because the girlfriend is resisting. And the DM says, yes. What? Why? Lo and behold, the roll is a success. And, the session kind of ends there. And we all just kind of leave. And I go home and I don't play D&D for 2 years after that. The DM's job there was to shut that down immediately. You have to be able to take a temperature of what's going on, especially if you're playing with strangers. And if a player is going to do that and take it that far, they can't be at your table. Like, you're actively ruining the fun for everyone else. You're not engaging in the game with people. You're actively working against everyone else's fun, and that's just unacceptable. It's not acceptable. So lust, it does not mean that you are the one, because it's obvious, like, hey, don't force your players into sexual encounters. That's obvious. Like, who's gonna even think to do that? But if your players are psychopaths, then, like, you need to shut it down. You need to have the confidence. You're like, this is our table. This is the table that I'm running. It is your job to protect your players from situations like that. Number 6, envy. Nobody wants a DMPC in their game, but it turns out that might be exactly what you get. That's a dead meme, but we're keeping it. So buckle up, buckaroo. You can read a lot online about why this is bad, but there is an urge at times, especially if you're like the forever DM, right? Where you never get to play, to create a player character that kind of travels around with the party, that you kind of role play as, and you kind of have your little self insert there into the story. I'm going to really suggest you don't do that. It creates a really strange dynamic, especially when you get to stuff like puzzles or even in combat, where you as the DM know what the solution is, and you know what the opponents in the combat are going to do on their next turn. So you know how to solve what the problem is. And if you're just kind of like sitting there and not saying anything, your PCs are going to be like, do you have anything to say to your DMPC? And then it's like, oh, well, I don't want to just solve the puzzle for you. Or in combat, it's like, the players want the glory for themselves, right? They want the glory of the kill. They want to roll the hit and all that. And you're already balancing so much in combat, for having the opponent's side, and then having your own turn. It's too much. I've never ran into a DM that's done this, but I can definitely see how the frustration could, build up. I've read so many stories about DMs who just kind of end up taking over games, and then that's no fun for the players either. So I would suggest, if you end up, if you have the time, if you end up being stuck as the forever DM for one of your player groups, find another group that you can play in. That's what I ended up doing, and I had a lot of fun doing that, and it worked out really well because I was really happy to run my own game, and then I also got my player kick from another game. Or, you should also be like, if you get kind of burnt out, just say, hey, guys or gals, just say, hey, I'm kind of burnt out on running these games. If we could just take a week or two to do a one shot that one of you guys could run, I would really appreciate that. And, players, like, they have ideas for campaigns, and sometimes the nervousness of DMing for the first time, especially if they haven't DM'd before, kind of prevents them from having the ambition because they're content to just play, but they do have kind of like these backshelf ideas. It's like, give them the opportunity, like prompt them to, take advantage of those ideas and actually implement them into a game, and, encourage them, say like, DMing, like, it's hard, but it's not something you can't learn. I would find it really strange if none of the players even wanted to take a crack at running a game. It's really important, and this is kind of like a broader point, but it's really important to communicate with your party on issues like this, just like personal stuff. It's true about the lust thing. You need to like talk about is like, okay, what are we comfortable with having in our game? Even if it's not sexual, like what level of description in like gore? Like if someone gets really queasy and doesn't really want like super detailed descriptions of gore, then don't include that either. If you're getting burnt out, just communicate with your players. Like they aren't just showing up to be audience members in your thing. You guys are working on something together. There's some kind of team dynamic there. And people, they respond well to that. They respect, like, they understand, like, the amount of effort that you put into your games and how, 1 week you might just not to be able to because life gets in the way or you get burnt out. That's totally okay. You don't need to feel obligated to always be prepared to run. And now the 7th and final sin, my sweet children, the most detrimental for the DM. This can do the most to not just tear your game apart, but ruin friendships. And it's gluttony. DMs, you're putting all this work into creating this game. And if your players still expect you to be the one to bring snacks every week, it breaks my heart even just to talk about it. That's a sin. Ask your players kindly to bring snacks, to show respect, and ask your players to bring snacks. And if you are a player, just do it. It will mean so much to your DM that you show up not just prepared with your character sheet and pencils and all that stuff, but also bringing snacks. Shows that you're committed to the game. It encourages the DM to keep going. It shows that you're excited. And it really, I'm being kind of jokey here, but it actually really does mean a lot. So DMs, don't bring your own snacks. Beg your players to. Okay. That's all the sins. You are now cleansed. Pope blesses you. Wow. So, those are the 7 deadly sins of DMing. Wasn't this a fun themed episode? I had fun making it. Shout out to Luke behind the camera. Luke, say hi.
Hi.
He appears in my skits and he helps me out a lot. Sorry we didn't have a skit this week. Some people think they're a little cheesy, and I couldn't think of one because I'm not that funny. If you like the video, go ahead and click like. And if you want to see more from me, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And this is me, your DM right now. This is me, your DM right now. And as your DM, the DM that you love, the DM that you want, I am giving you advantage on your next attack roll to hit that notification bell, because I really want you to crit, and I really want you to watch my videos because I work really hard on them. If you don't know, I do D&D world building on Tuesday, Thursdays, 5, 8 Eastern. And so if you want to come check that out, follow twitch.tv/ZachKenny, link in description. And yeah, other than that, have a great week and happy gaming.